In this video, we're going to help you determine if you have a tight pelvic floor.
What are the signs and symptoms, and what do you need to know to start healing today? If you haven't met me yet, I'm Dr. Jessica London, pelvic floor physical therapist and pre- and postnatal strength training coach and owner of Your Postpartum PT. So let's dive in. Before we can dive into knowing if you have a tight pelvic floor, we first have to address where is the pelvic floor and what is it? So briefly in this particular video, I'm going to go over it very quickly, but I do have other videos that you can dive into that go into what the pelvic floor is, its functions and dysfunctions in much more depth. So the pelvic floor sits at the bottom of your pelvis here. It starts at the pubic bone here, wraps all the way around to the back of the tailbone, and then goes between your two sit bones here, the two bony landmarks at the bottom of your pelvis. So if you're rocking side to side, you feel those two bones, your pelvic floor is between that space. And then if you reach back, feel your tailbone, reach in the front, feel your pubic bone, the pelvic floor also slings right in between there. You, of course, also have your pelvic organs. So you have your bladder, your uterus, and your rectum here that sit on top of the pelvic floor. So oftentimes when we work with clients one-on-one or in a group setting, we notice that some people have more of a tight pelvic floor versus a looser pelvic floor. And gone are the days where Kegels are going to solve everybody's pelvic floor issues. What we're finding is that more people actually have a tight pelvic floor versus a loose or open pelvic floor. And there's a couple signs and symptoms that will be able to kind of alert you to if you do have a tight pelvic floor. First, let's go over what tight even means and what optimal function of the pelvic floor is. So I like to use my handy dandy slinky here, and I like to think of the pelvic floor as a very buoyant muscle group. It has 3 layers of muscles at the bottom of the pelvis here. It's very buoyant, kind of like a trampoline. It can go up and down, and it provides 5 different functions. So when we think of the pelvic floor like a slinky, we want to think of optimal function of the pelvic floor kind of sitting in this gently open state. It has the ability to contract and shorten its muscle fibers just like this, but it also has the ability to lengthen its muscle fibers and elongate. So an optimal working pelvic floor lives in an optimal state right in the middle here, where it has the ability to contract and to lengthen, contract and lengthen. And it does this through autonomic and somatic, right? Autonomic nervous system means it's doing it on its own without you even having to think about it. It's doing this as you walk, as you step, as you brace your core, as you stand on one leg. It is going to know what to do based off of those functions. Unless you have pelvic floor dysfunction, of course, then you'll start noticing other signs and symptoms that is telling you that this pelvic floor that you have is probably not working in optimal range of motion and an optimal function of being able to contract and lengthen and release and being able to live more in that optimal state. So when we think about a tight pelvic floor, we tend to see that the muscle fibers are too close together. They're too shortened, too tight and toned, if you will. So this is also called hypertonicity or having a hypertonic pelvic floor, where they're a little bit closer together and you're not able to experience that release or even elongation and lengthening, right? So of course, pelvic floor needs to be able to release, but it also needs to be able to lengthen as well. So someone that is living more in a chronic tense pelvic floor state or chronic hypertonicity at the pelvic floor is living in a shortened state where the muscle fibers are close, they're tight, and they're tense together. If you are experiencing this, there's a couple signs and symptoms that you can kind of be on the lookout for to actually help you register, oh wait, I might have a tight pelvic floor, and being able to release and lengthen. Typically, people that have tight pelvic floors really do not need Kegels, right? Kegels, the contraction of the pelvic floor, right? Contract and squeeze your pelvic floor. This can actually make the pelvic floor worse. It can also exacerbate your symptoms and make your symptoms worse as well. So people experiencing pelvic floor tension or a tight pelvic floor often experience things like pain with intimacy, pain with penetration, because the vaginal canal is right here. And if it's super guarded, tight, and tense, then you're going to have a lot of irritation, because what needs to have happen with intimacy and penetration is the pelvic floor needs to be able to open, to release, surrender, relax. So if the pelvic floor is living in that chronic tight state, it might experience pain with intimacy. You also, from a sexual function, you might also not be able to achieve an orgasm, or you might have pain around the orgasm because it's too tight and tense. The pelvic floor actually needs to be able to release to be able to fully rhythmically contract as well for that. Other signs and symptoms of a tight pelvic floor are deep hip pain, deep tailbone pain, pelvic floor tension, pelvic floor pain, pubic symphysis pain, or even back pain too. As you can see that the back is very closely interconnected into the pelvic floor system. So hips are right here in these hip sockets. They kind of come out and right down. There's also connections from the hips into the pelvic floor as well. So if you're experiencing a tight pelvic floor, sometimes people will say, I just have really deep hip pain. I can't get to it. I can't stretch it or foam roll it or trigger point release it out. It just feels like it's so deep in there. Or also even just tension in the pelvic floor, feeling like you are constantly clenching your glutes, right? That are back here and very connected into that pelvic floor as well. So we'll tend to see like chronic glute clenchers, shoving the hips forward and just kind of, hanging all of that pressure on the back part, or even experiencing back pain as a result of the high tension that's going on in the pelvic floor. Just know that the pelvic floor does not work in isolation, right? The pelvic floor, the hips, the glutes, the adductors, the core system, the diaphragm, the thoracic spine, and the rib cage, everything is working together. So if one part of the body, the pelvic floor system, is too tight, too guarded, too tense, it can start to affect its neighbors, right? The hips, the adductors, the pubic symphysis, the back, and we'll start to notice pain and dysfunction in other parts of the body. So those are other signs and symptoms of a tight pelvic floor. In addition to chronic UTI infections or said UTI infections, maybe you feel like you have a UTI or there's an infection there, you go to the doctor, you get labs, the labs come out clear and clean, and maybe the doctor has even told you, labs are clear, you're good to go. Maybe you just have repeated UTI infections where you're feeling like you're constantly on antibiotics all the time. Oftentimes, this is a missed sign for pelvic floor dysfunction, and you need to be working directly with a pelvic floor therapist who understands the pelvic floor and can allow you to be able to release and lengthen, help you get there so we can take as much pressure off of the urethra opening here, which can also cause a lot of irritation at the nerves around that area, which might be causing the feeling of a UTI-like symptom. Other things can be bladder urgency or leakage. So because the bladder is so interconnected into the front part of the pelvic floor here, and because there's also nerves and ligaments and fascial interconnections into this area, you might also experience bladder urgency, where you feel like you get the urge and you have to rush to go to the bathroom right away. You don't have time, right? You're always maybe looking for the nearest bathroom. You're packing panty liners or change of clothes just in case you have experienced leakage, or just feeling like the inability to hold the urge. This can also be a sign of tight pelvic floor, as well as leakage, right? So oftentimes people think of bladder leakage or pelvic heaviness, like prolapse symptoms, only being a factor if you have a weak pelvic floor or like a loose pelvic floor. And while you can experience leakage and you can experience pelvic heaviness with a more open or released, pelvic floor that doesn't have as much tone or coordination, endurance, and strength that it needs, you can also experience bladder leakage and pelvic heaviness increase symptoms if the pelvic floor is too tight. This can cause a lot of crowding in this pelvic bowl, which can also irritate the bladder itself. It can irritate the colon. It can irritate the uterus as well in that vaginal canal that's connected into the bottom. So if the pelvic floor is super tight and tense and guarded, it can also affect these pelvic organs inside the pelvic bowl as well, and increase constipation, leakage, or the feeling of pelvic heaviness or the feeling of prolapse, where the organs might not be descended, but you have the feeling of that fullness or that pelvic heaviness or the bulging that's going on at the bottom of the pelvic floor just because your pelvic floor is too tight and tense. So I think that covers pretty much all of the signs and symptoms that we look out for when we're trying to detect pelvic floor tightness. But other things that drive it is nervous system upregulation or high anxiety or lots of stress. This can also cause the nervous system to be kind of frazzled, or what we call in fight or flight. This can cause the nervous system to send a lot of energy, a lot of voltage, if you will, to the pelvic floor. And so it's getting overstimulated, which is over-contracting the pelvic floor. When you have a tight pelvic floor and those fibers are really tight and close together, this also means that the pelvic floor is weak. So a misconception is that, oh, the pelvic floor is weak only when we're in this elongated state, but actually the pelvic floor can be weak in an elongated state, and it can also be really weak in a shortened, contracted state. So what we're looking for is full optimal range of motion, full optimal function in the pelvic floor, the ability to stay in this optimal open state, but also for the pelvic floor to be able to contract when it needs to relax when it needs to, and to elongate when it needs to as well. So other, last signs and symptoms that I missed earlier is around the sphincters, right? So around the urethra is a small little circular muscle. And when the pelvic floor is too tight and too tense, sometimes it feels like you have to force or push to be able to have a bladder or bowel movement. So that's where constipation can come in. But those sphincters, if they're too tight and tense, when we experience a bowel movement or a bladder movement to be able to release urine or bowel from the pelvic floor and the pelvic organs, we want the pelvic floor to be able to open, to release, to lengthen. So if it doesn't have that ability to do that, it might feel like you go to the bathroom and you have to push really hard to force the urine out or to force the bowel out so that you can have, good function down there. So that's another sign and symptom that you should be on the lookout for if you're starting to experience that. So where should you go from here, right? I think it's really important to address that there's a lot of information out there online, and the standard advice of just do exercises, just do Kegels, just do more bridges and strengthening exercises here actually are not going to work, right? So when we have too tight of a pelvic floor, the first thing we need to do is to find the root cause. And this is why even comparing pelvic floor therapist to pelvic floor therapist, you're going to get multiple different strategies and approaches to being able to heal the pelvic floor. Our approach, our belief system with a tight pelvic floor, which has helped thousands of people and many women who have tried many different in-person pelvic floor therapists without resolution, is to focus on a somatic root cause approach that focuses on nervous system healing, nervous system relaxation, and allowing the nervous system to get out of that fight or flight response. So in my opinion, if we are focused on the hypertonicity in the pelvic floor and all you do is get a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball and you roll it out, or someone told you to sit on a foam roller and relax it and sit on a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball and release those trigger points, maybe even going in person and getting an internal exam or getting internal releases because your pelvic floor is too tight, that, in my opinion, is a Band-Aid solution because it's actually not addressing the root cause of why the pelvic floor is tight in the first place. So with our team, with my approach, with our coaches, our pelvic floor therapists, and our team approaches, we work through a somatic nervous system healing approach that allows us to be able to get to the root cause of why you're experiencing hypertonicity in the first place, okay? And so through this nervous system approach, we're looking to understand what's triggering the nervous system in the first place to send you into a fight or flight response. And there can be a long laundry list of reasons of why this is happening for you. What's most important is that we address it for you, because why it's happening for one person might be different than why it's happening for another person. So this is really important to make sure that you're using a trauma-informed therapist. You're making sure that you're using a pelvic floor therapist that's trained in somatic and nervous system techniques that is going to be able to get down to the root cause of why you're experiencing so much upregulation in the nervous system to cause the tension, to cause the tightening to happen at the pelvic floor. Once we identify that root cause, then we're focused on finding safety in the nervous system, safety in the body, allowing you to somatically, spatially connect to the pelvic floor. That will help bring blood flow to the area. It will allow us to be able to guide you to release the pelvic floor, which is step one. After we learn how to release, we then need to learn how to lengthen, which is step two. And so we can do this by identifying the trigger, understanding the root cause, and then giving you specific education modules and educational tips and tricks. Lifestyle modification changes can be really huge for you as well here. Understanding how to manage stress, understanding how to bring the nervous system out of the fight or flight into more healing, a safety place, so that you can actually address the muscle tissue itself that is just responding to the nervous system. So this also can be supportive through exercises that are going to help the release and the lengthening. And after step three, right? So after we do the release work and then we do the lengthening work, then we can work into the strengthening, right? So before we can just start going right into bridges and Kegels, if you will, and contractions, we need to first release, and then we can focus on strengthening, not just the pelvic floor, but the surrounding structures, the glutes, the adductors, the hamstrings, the hips, the back muscles that are going to contribute to making sure that the pelvic floor is not the only one working, right? We want to make sure all of the people in the office are at work, and that we didn't send 5 people out of the office on vacation, leaving just one person left to do all of the work, which can happen easily with someone that has a hypertonic or tense pelvic floor. So there you have it. That's hopefully going to give you more insight, little education, a little awareness into why you might be experiencing hypertonic pelvic floor, why you might be experiencing having more of a tight pelvic floor, to address signs and symptoms of that you might be having. And also really the next steps are for you to start working on the somatic and the nervous system healing approach. That's really going to get down to the root cause of why you're dealing with this. We work with women one-on-one all of the time that have hypertonicity, tightness in their pelvic floor, that really need a strategic plan that is backed by evidence-based medicine, that is guided, there's accountability and progressions. And right now we're offering a $97 pelvic floor reset challenge, where you can be able to initially jump in with us at a very low risk, low cost, be able to get a one-on-one customized approach to your healing by having a one-on-one video call that's going to talk through your symptoms, what you're experiencing, have you fill out some intake paperwork, just to make sure that we're not also missing something as well, and to be able to give you more answers and clarity. It's also going to come with a 7-day action plan, right? So this 7-day action plan is going to get you straight into being able to get started, downloading the knowledge, becoming more online with your pelvic floor, getting acquainted with it again, getting somatically and spatially connected to it, so we can start that release process, so we can start that elongation process, and so that you have answers and clarity in as little as 7 days. I'll drop a link below for you to be able to access that. But if you're also feeling like, I just kind of want to learn a little bit more, I need more DIY style, I'll go ahead and also drop our community below, where you can access so much more information, modules, education, exercises, and get direct coaching with me as well in a group setting, where you can do it more DIY independently on your own. So there's 2 options for you depending on what feels most in alignment, and I'll see you in the next episode.